Loneliness is different from other personal issues. We all believe we should have friends and loved ones. We can feel shame if we don't, and we can be lonely even if there are other people around us. Miriam Amdur, you've been open about your struggles with loneliness. So please tell us what your experience was and how it moved you to create 52 Friends.
So I experienced a period of loneliness. I think for me, it was a couple different things. First, it was obviously the pandemic, which I think a lot of us can relate to. Then it was also a function of age. I'm 25, so I think that's a point in time when we move from our childhood friends to our adult friends, which can also cause a lot of loneliness. And then the last thing is that I was living in between two cities. I was in between Toronto and Miami, and I think when you live in between two places, you prevent yourself from building a life either here or there. And I really felt that. It was kind of this existential loneliness where I would go to a party and feel like really empty with all these people, and I think that's an experience that a lot of us have.
What about your group?
So I basically made it my goal to make one friend a week or reconnect with an old friend over the course of 52 weeks. At the beginning, I was candidly really focused on new friends, and then I realized that maybe that was kind of a mistake. So I started to really reach out to old friends, like people from high school, university that I hadn't spoken to in years, and those relationships were really fulfilling. So it was nice to be able to reach out to an old friend. Pete always says with the General Project that you can't make an old friend, so that's something that I remember and something that was influential to my project. And then the second half, once I made it to 25 friends, I began to focus on also my current relationships. So my relationships with my grandparents, for example, or my siblings and things like that. So those relationships are also really important.
Oren, what about that, feeling lonely even if you're around a lot of other people?
Yeah, it's interesting. Pete and I were talking earlier about this. It's an existential disconnect, not just from people, but from a sense of connectedness to something that's important to you. And as social animals, human connection is one of the most important things that we have. So even if we do have hundreds of people around us, whether virtually or in reality, if we don't feel a sense of a deeper bond, a connection, a sense of security, or somebody has our back, we can still feel the profound effects of loneliness, regardless of how many people are around us.
You know, Pete, there was a study recently, and it was a huge number of people who said they didn't have a couple of people that they could rely on to be there for them in an emergency or whatever. And I found that just profoundly bad.
Well, we've created the most individualistic society in history. We've had the advent of technology over the last 20 years, and we're spending more time on that and at work than ever before. And I think the pandemic really was the wake-up call for us all to say, hey, I may not have those friends, but now we need to start giving people the steps of, what am I going to do about it? Because now that we've woken up on the other side of the pandemic, now's the time that I think people are open to the conversation of, if I don't have friends, how can I help solve that?
It's kind of a lifelong process of making friends and sometimes, unfortunately, shedding friends who turn out to be maybe frenemies.
We've done some research with older adults, members of the Retired Teachers of Ontario, and we heard stories from them about how important it is to maintain social connections, but there's just so many challenges, especially as we get older, and that's why I think older adults in particular are at risk for loneliness. So, stories of going to university and having these close groups of friends that you'd see every year, and then, slowly the group gets smaller and smaller, or, having to move when in retirement and leave a community you love, full of lots of friends and neighbors, and sort of start over, being out of the workplace. Declines in health or changes in health can make it really difficult, again, to do some of the things that you used to really love to do.
That's something that we found as well, that the life space of older adults shrinks. And so they have less opportunities to make those connections. And some of the work that we've done, we've been able to reduce the perceived loneliness by like half with some of the projects, just by getting them out of the house and talking to other people.
And it is about perception and also being realistic and recognizing that we outgrow people, or people can be more toxic than positive. And I have many patients who come from a small community and they start off in childhood, and as they get older and older, and they actually, the irony is they're forced to stay within that community, and it's not healthy anymore. So they feel lonely in that regard because they're supposed to be connected with them. These are their roots, these are the people that they grew up with, but they actually outgrew them. And so trying to maintain something that's really not working for you, it makes you feel that something's wrong. And someone used the word, I think, fulfilling. Fulfillment is so important that there has to feel like there's a sense of meaning and purpose, and then you're deriving benefit from it. And so you have to really evaluate your friendships, your relationships, and so on, kind of weigh the pros and cons and say, is this doing more good than harm, or vice versa, and make decisions based on that.
And people are reluctant to do that, I guess, especially with old friends.
Yeah, I think that that's like a measure of community belonging, right? And how it's the other side of isolation, because you can be in a crowd, like you said, you can be with people, but you feel lonely. And so there's other things as well, like matching with people's values. So some of the programs that we have are culturally specific, so Afrocentric frameworks to bring people in so they can identify and they feel like they belong. And that's something that's very important as well.
And you mentioned something about people moving. It was interesting. I have a medical panel as well. And one of the doctors says she keeps telling her older patients, you have this dream of moving to some rural place in the country. You need to be close to medical facilities, but also uprooting yourself. I mean, this whole idea of aging in place and this, walkable communities, this is where you have your roots and you are doing something, and suddenly, and I know people, well-off people, and they do things like they'll go and buy a farm in the middle of nowhere, and they like renovating, so that's what they're doing. But to me, it doesn't seem like a smart thing to do.
But everybody's different, right? So some people, being alone or solitude versus loneliness are two different things, Libby. So for some people, that separation from the broader population may be something they're very comfortable with. And I think this is part of the education, and certainly the work that the Gen Well Project is trying to do as Canada's Human Connection movement, is starting by saying, you need to understand what loneliness is. Before the pandemic, most people thought loneliness happened to people that were socially isolated, who were physically alone. And now, to Oren's comment, it's far more than that. It is that lack of belonging, and when we understand how we can feel it, and we understand that it's a human feeling and that we all will go through it at different times in our lives, now the question is, okay, how can we help people take that first step? Is it saying hello to a stranger, talking to a neighbor, calling up an old friend like you did? There's so many ways, but oftentimes we forget how to make it happen.
On that note, let's take a short break, and we'll be right back with more of the Zoomer.